Alrighty, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our final program in honor of National Family History Month. Today, Regina Fitzpatrick, our genealogy librarian here at the New Jersey State Library, is going to be talking about how to find your women ancestors in New Jersey, exploring some of the unique ways to find women ancestors throughout the history of the colony and the state of New Jersey. Before we jump into our presentation, I just have some housekeeping items to go over. We will be taking your questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to submit them at any time using the Q&A or the chat feature in the Zoom dashboard. If your question involves, you're looking for a specific ancestor and there's a lot of information around it, we ask that you please email Regina directly with those questions because a lot of times there's a lot of context and other information that needs to be involved in order to answer these questions. So we ask that if you're going to ask questions, try to keep them general. And if you have specific questions, Regina will give you her contact information, so you'll be able to contact her directly. Um, Regina has provided a copy of the presentation slides, which I will be uploading to the chat momentarily. If you have troubles downloading them from the chat, don't worry, they will be available in the follow-up email as an attachment. At the end of the webinar, if you have time, please complete the survey. We really and truly appreciate all feedback that you can give us. And if you want more information on genealogy research 24/7, you can check out our genealogy research guide that Regina curates. It's available on the web address on the screen there. I will also send that out in the chat momentarily so that everybody can have a live link to it. Then one last thing before we jump into her presentation. This is just a brief overview of the Zoom dashboard. This is what your dashboard should look like if you're using a PC or a Mac. If you're using a mobile device, the dashboard may look a little bit different, but all of the features will still be there. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can check your audio settings. So if you're using an external listening device like a headset or earbuds, you can check to make sure they're connected properly there. At any point during the presentation, if there are any issues, you can hit this raise hand button here in the middle. That'll alert me. I will send you a message in Zoom and hopefully be able to resolve any problems that you are having. And as I mentioned, if you do have questions, there's the Q&A and the chat buttons. You can use either of them to get in touch with us, and we're happy to address them. So that is everything that I have. So I'm going to turn it over to Regina now.
Thank you, Andrew. Everybody, just give me 1 minute to share my screen. And I'm going to, if you see me looking down, I'm setting a timer on my watch to keep myself honest. Also, I really apologize. There's an issue with my display. So to look at the slides, you're going to see me looking over this way a whole lot. So I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be rude. I promise I will look your way when when uh when you have questions for me. Alrighty. So there we go. I want to dive right in because this is pretty information packed. As Andrew mentioned, you are getting the slides. So I hope that will help you kind of read, digest the information that I will be sharing today. Those of you who may have taken this class in the past, it is a little bit different. I've included a lot of new examples, and I hope that you enjoy. So, there we go. Okay, so very briefly, what I would like to accomplish today is I would like to look at how we research stuff in the vital records era, which is after May of 1848, which is when the state of New Jersey began to collect vital records. I would like to talk about some collections that fall before May of 1848, and I would like also to talk about strategies for when your woman ancestor does not appear on an index, might not be represented as herself in a collection, or might not be represented at all in a collection, but how you can use her ancestors or her relatives to gain clues about where to look for her. Vital records are obviously the Holy Grail, you can see here, if I can find my mouse, we are looking at the death certificate of Rose Isaacson, who died in Paterson at a hospital of influenza in 1918. So she was part of the global influenza pandemic. But you can see in just this brief little document how much information there is about her, including her home address, where she was buried, when she was buried, when exactly she died, how old she was, what her father's name was, who the informant on her death certificate was. And all of that will help us find clues about Rose and how we could research her. And we will talk about examples of this throughout the presentation. And further examples of how useful vital records are. Unfortunately, many of the vital records collections are not digitized themselves online, except for the very earliest New Jersey vital records, which are from May of 1848 to May of 1878. And these have been digitized and they're available to look at on Ancestry. So those are the actual vital records, not just indexes. Indexes are most of what is online, and that is still very helpful because once you have an exact date of death, etc., or marriage, it makes it much easier to get your hands on the actual vital records. Just the index, if you have a date to work with, you can look for clues in other collections as well. If you are looking at records that are at least 100 years old, so birth records that are at least 100 years old and older, all the way back to May of 1848, or marriage or death records May of 1848 to December of 1940, order those from the state archives. Um, any birth records that are less than 100 years old or marriage and death records after 1940 can be ordered from the Office of Vital Statistics and Registry. As I mentioned, many of the actual vital records themselves are not digitized. However, there are many indexes that you can look at. I have links to the two indexes that are available on the State Archives website. Obviously, that's useful since you order those records right from there. When you are looking at indexes on in other places that represent the New Jersey State Vital Records collections, remember, you're going to be ordering them if they meet the time period requirements from the state archives still. So don't look for the records themselves there. You're going to have to order the actual records from either the state archives or the Office of Vital Statistics. What is very nice is that the marriage and death indexes for New Jersey that represent the New Jersey State Vital Records collection are incredibly extensive. The marriages go up to 1916 and the deaths go up to, or 1916, I'm sorry, 2016, and the deaths go up to 2017. Again, the more modern records you would order from Office of Vital Statistics. The older stuff with the dates that I've supplied up on the slide here, you would order from the state archives. So again, behind the actual marriage certificate, I have a screenshot of the bride's index from 1901 to 2016. And you can see that I was able to find Louise Morton on here. I put this example because it's sometimes very useful to be able to look up the wife instead of the husband, especially if she has a really easy name to spell and he has a more difficult one that's likely to be very butchered. Um, that's a great reason to check these brides index rather than searching by his name. Um, Once we have this information, we know that they were married in 1946. We can then go and we can find the actual certificate. And the actual certificate is what is going to have all of the nice biographical information. From this, we know that Louise's family is from New Jersey. We have her exact date of birth. We know where she was born. We have her parents' names. We know where she was living at the time of her marriage. So we have a lot of information that we could use to research her family. Um, and then if we were interested in researching Russell's mom, we have her name and her maiden name. We don't know when they were born, but we have his exact date of birth and we have where he was born again. So we could use his information for clues to look up more information on her. So again, like I said before, these certificates are fantastic because they pack a lot of information into a tiny little document. If you are looking at vital records collection pre-May of 1848, the only one that exists are marriages. Unfortunately, there's no comprehensive collection of either births or deaths in New Jersey at the time. However, that does not mean you can't still build clues. So, two marriage collections that we have available to us if we are looking uh, in the pre-May of 1848 time period are the colonial marriage bonds and the county marriage records. Unfortunately, these have a lot less biographical information, and one doesn't even give you a marriage date. It's the date of a bond. Um, but again, we can still use these to build clues. So colonial marriage bonds, and I have an example document here closest to the slide text, is a collection that starts in the very early 1700s and goes up to about 1800s. I have the date for this collection overall because pre-1700, this collection does include some actual marriage records, which is pretty cool. So if you are researching ancestors pre-1700 and you're looking for a marriage record, this collection may be relevant to your interest because it does have actual uh, marriage dates. Again, these guys are bonds. They are not actual marriage record, but because the families took were willing to put up a considerable amount of money to make sure the marriage was above board, you can almost guarantee that the couple married each other. It's fantastic for researching wealthy families because, again, they had to put up a 500-pound bond, uh, swearing that no impediments to the pending marriage existed, basically. Um, the one interesting thing about these is if you have any indication that either the bride or the groom was under 21, if you flip the bond over on the other side, there may be a note from the parents or the dad stating, I am okay with this marriage. Yay, because they were minors getting married. They might find a parent need or guardian needed to sign off. If dad was no longer with us, mom may have signed the bond too. So you will likely get one parent's name uh, on the back of either party if either party was under the age of 21. Um, Again, I mentioned that the language here is very boilerplate. You can see it's a printed form with spaces to fill in what little details there are. Regarding the bride and groom, it gives you their place of residence and their occupation. In this case, the parties are Edward Pierce and Catherine Talbot. For Catherine, we know that she lives in Burlington County and that she's a widow. So we know from that that Talbot is her first married name. So maybe from that we can start looking her up in other places and get some more information about her. The first place that I would check is the wills collection to see if her first husband left her any money or any property or identified himself, or possibly identified members of her family as well, so we could get maybe her maiden name. The other collection I would immediately check is the early land records collection, looking for deeds, because those can be surprising genealogical gold mines, and we're going to talk about those later. Now, the county marriages are actual marriage records, but like the colonial marriage bond, they include very little personal information. It usually has the party's name, the date of the marriage, the officiant, and because these are generally presented in a list format, if you flip it back to the beginning of the person's list, when the officiant's list, when he started it, you can sometimes, if he was a clergyman at a particular church, you can get the name of the place where they were married. I selected this particular example because it's a loose marriage return, so it does have a little bit more information. We know that the parties were married at St. Francis Church in Trenton. We have the date of marriage. We have their names, John Barry and Alice Hogan, and we have two witnesses plus the officiant's name right there. So we have several clues. We could check church records since this marriage occurred in the vital records era. What I might do is I might go to that collection on ancestry, the digitized vital records. This is 1853. And remember, May of 1848 to May of 1878. So that will fall right in there. I might look them up in that collection and see if I can find a New Jersey state marriage record for them that might have a little bit more biographical information. I could also check them on the census. We know where they got married. We might be able to find both families on the census in 1850. Um, and uh, and that's kind of where I would start if I wanted to learn more about Alice and her family. So, as I said, unfortunately, there are no really comprehensive birth and death collections. You're looking largely at church or cemetery records, and what is available uh, varies from place to place, unfortunately. But we are very lucky in the pre-vital records era that we have these these marriage collections, so we can trace women back through this. I want to spend some time on this on naturalizations because this collection, especially in the United States, had a huge impact on women. Um, Please feel free to ask me questions. I will do my best to answer them. I've also put tons of links throughout this section so you can read text of laws and things like that. Um, so what we are going to do first is we are going to talk about women's citizenship and naturalization records and clues that you can look for as you are researching a woman ancestor in this type of record. And then we are going to talk about the parts of the naturalization records from the counties. These were the most prevalent, well, these were the only type of naturalization records, unless somebody naturalized through the federal government for a large part of US history. This is how the system worked uh, between the county's founding date, so late 18th century in some cases, to the mid-ish 20th century. These records are held by usually the county clerk, who is the clerk of the Court of Common Pleas, which is where most of these naturalizations occurred. So that is the record group that we are talking about. That is the record group that we are going to be looking at examples of. So we are going to go through that context and talk about why these are important, why this is an important collection, and why you should be paying careful attention if you have women ancestors who were affected by immigration at all. We'll talk about the parts of the application, and then we are going to look at some examples. So first things first, women gained the right to vote in 1920 because of the 19th Amendment. A couple years later, suffragists worked hard uh, and advocated for additional women's rights in marriage. Um, the Cable Act passed, and the Cable Act uh, basically created a path for a woman to become a citizen in her own right, whereas before 1922, she was naturalizing under her husband or her father. So she could become a citizen in her own right. And also, there was an act that had passed in 1907 that stripped native-born U.S. women of citizenship if they married somebody who was not a naturalized United States citizen. So if somebody was foreign born and your woman ancestor got married between 1907 and 1922, pay attention to that because she might have lost her citizenship. So the Cable Act stopped that practice essentially. So after 1922, make sure you're looking her up in her own right. Before 1922, she might still have naturalized in her own right. Like my great great grandmother was a widow and she came over here from Italy with two small kids. She naturalized in her own right because she wasn't married at the time, and she got naturalization for her two minor children as well. Um, But if she was married or if she came over with her family, she may have naturalized under her her husband or her father. And again, I mentioned this, she might, if she got married between 1907 and 1922 and she was American, but she married somebody foreign who was not a U.S. citizenship, she may have lost her U.S. citizenship if he never naturalized. A law in 1936 came to be that established how women who were married between 1907 and 1922 could reestablish their citizenship. They could take an oath at a local U.S. district courts and reclaim their citizenship. I happened to stumble upon, as I was doing research for this presentation, the repatriation oaths for the U.S. District Court at Essex County, at Newark, I'm sorry. And I was looking in Newark, or not Newark, in Essex County records for example documents that I could use for this presentation. And I clicked on something and I said, repatriation oaths, what's that? And it sent me down this whole rabbit hole. And so I wanted to include these in these presentation since they are another record group out of New Jersey, although they are federal, not state or county records. It might help you if you had a woman who was in this particular situation. So this particular collection is digitized. I don't know if that means all U.S. District Court repatriation oaths across the United States are also digitized. It might be something to check, like if you know you have a U.S. District Court in your area and are interested in seeing if they have these record types, that might be something to look into. So all that to say, be careful if you had an American woman ancestor and you know that she possibly married somebody foreign between 1907 and 1922. And also just keep in mind of that pre-1922 and post-1922 division, because that determines whether or not a foreign-born woman was naturalizing herself or was naturalizing under her husband, who was also foreign-born. There are clues that we can use in the population schedules of the federal census starting in 1900 for citizenship status. So if you're not sure about when exactly your relative might have naturalized, you can use the census to uh, to kind of figure that out, especially if they naturalized after 1900. Um, I think pre-1900, there might be some very limited citizenship information. You can always check too. They usually have like a person's place of birth. So that can that might tell you whether or not somebody was born abroad. Unfortunately, until if they lived, um, you might not be able to see whether or not they naturalized until 1900. So if a person then starting in 1900, there's a specific column where you can look for these codes. There's a citizenship heading, and then if you look down, you may see AL, PA, or NA. AL means that the person has not yet naturalized. They are a foreign-born person living in the United States, an alien. PA means that they filed their declaration of intention, which we're going to talk about in a minute. That's the first part of the naturalization application. And NA means that their petition for naturalization has been accepted and they are now a U.S. citizen. So there are two parts to a naturalization. And remember, these are these County Court of Common Pleas records. This was a system that was set up by law. Um, and these were the parts. So part one is the declaration of intention, which formally establishes an individual wants to become a United States citizen. The second part of is the petition for naturalization, and that is filed once a person meets a particular residency requirement. They live in the United States for a certain amount of time. They can then file their petition after they have filed their declaration. Always make sure that when you are looking at these records, that you look up the petition first, because that will contain the full application for citizenship, including the declaration. And you can get these records in New Jersey from either the state archives. The county clerks have turned, of certain counties have turned their records over to the state archives, or you can order them directly from the county clerk. If you follow the link that I have under the New Jersey State Archives, that takes you to the naturalization records order screen. They tell you what counties they have and for what years at the top of the form. So you will be able to see immediately. Okay, so now we are going to look at some examples, the caveat being that before 1907, these applications will have very little biographical detail, unfortunately, and we are going to compare and contrast uh, an application from after 1907 and one from before 1907. So this is Catherine Volku's application for citizenship. This was all under her petition for naturalization filing, and her petition, which are actually these two pages here on the far right of the screen. This is the actual petition. But I've blown up the declaration because it has her photograph, it has her signature on her photograph, and I just thought that was really cool. She filed her petition in the late 1930s, and her citizenship was approved in the early 1940s. Um, this has a ton of biographical information, personal information. It includes a physical description of her. We know her exact town of birth. She was born in Romania. We know her date of birth. We know who her husband was, where they got married, and the date of their marriage. We know that she and her husband have two children who are both United States citizens and are listed on her application with their birth dates. We know where she lives currently at the time of her application. We know the exact date she arrived here in this country. We know what ship she took, and we know what port she left in Europe. So we have lots and lots and lots of clues if we would like to trace her family back to Romania. Thanks to this certificate of arrival, we have her maiden name. We can see she's anglicized her name from Catalin to Catherine. So it might be worth investigating whether or not perhaps she legally changed her name. That might be a cool record to check. Because we have her direct address and we have dates of significance in her life, we can then go to particular census years and kind of trace her movements. Um, in that case, what is interesting here is there's a notice of objection, and that's this document here, placed by the Commissioner of Immigration and Naturalizations to leave her petition standing and not have a final hearing to make her a citizen, because at the time in 1942, Romania was aligned with the Axis powers. And so she was a foreign-born citizen with which the United States, of a country with which the United States was at war. So they held her application for a certain amount of time, but they did approve it. And you can see that she takes an oath of allegiance, which is dated April 1943. So she was approved. So we have tons of interesting details here, tons of things to investigate, tons of things that we could look up to flesh out Catherine's life. Now, in our next example, we're not really after John here. We're really after his wife, Francisca. Let's just say for the state, for the sake of argument. Um, but we can use this as a starting point to get to Francisca. So we know that Francisca's husband, John Spiegelhalder, filed a declaration of intention in September 1859. Interestingly, by the 1860 census, the family is in Philadelphia. I chose this particular example because John had actually signed his application. And as I was going through these online, I saw lots of people who made their mark. They probably could not write, possibly could not read. Um, and they signed by Mark. John was one of the few people who actually signed, and I was hoping that that meant he was a person who was a little bit more wealthy and I could more easily trace him through censuses. And I was able to do that. You can see this should kind of remind you of the colonial marriage bonds because it's a lot of printed stuff with a few blanks to fill in relevant information. And you can see how little personal information there is in John's declaration versus Catherine's. Um, we do know that he is from Baden in Germany. We have his name. Fortunately, he has a fairly unusual name, so hopefully that will help us find him on the census. And it does. Surprisingly, by 1860, the family is in Philadelphia, uh, gives us tons of information, tells us where the kids were born. They were up in New York. Um, because we're able to trace them through the census and city directories, we're able to see what the kids are up to as they get older. We know that the oldest daughter was born in Baden, so presumably uh, the parents got married over there. Um, and what's interesting is if we look at their son John's so John and Francisca's son, John, at his death certificate, he was a mechanic, so he was very easy to trace through the census because eventually, well, the city directories, because eventually he owned his own auto shop, was able to get his death certificate. His death certificate has his mom's maiden name, which makes it very easy for us to go back to Baden and hopefully try to find her marriage records and maybe go backwards and trace her family back if that is our object. Um, so even though this has very little information and it's not the direct person that we are looking for, this gives us maybe enough clues. I mean, we're very lucky that John has fairly unusual name because if you're dealing with a Patrick Murphy, that makes things harder here. But if your relative has a fairly unusual name, you can still use other collections to find clues and build. And by the way, I was also able to trace John very easily because he was a cordwainer and it went back and forth between calling him a cordwainer and saying like shoe repairs, that he was in the shoe repair industry. So that helped me trace the family through uh, through the years and get all of this information. So those are kind of the two contrasting applications. Obviously, since John was in Philadelphia the rest of his life after this, the family settled in Philadelphia. If he did naturalize, um, his petition for naturalization would be in Philadelphia. It would not be in Somerset County. So only his declaration is in Somerset. And then if he decided to continue applying for his citizenship, he probably would have completed the petition in Philadelphia. And then finally, I wanted to show you one of these repatriation oaths from the U.S. District Court. Again, this is a digitized collection on FamilySearch.org. Again, we have a lot of personal information on here that we could use to trace Laura Van Sant's family. We know that she was married in 1916, I think that is, um, in Camden, New Jersey. So we could get her marriage certificate. I picked this particular certificate because many of the laws were designed to be exclusionary against certain groups of people. And I was surprised to see somebody uh who married an English person from Great Britain with one of these documents. Somehow I thought maybe there would be a loophole, but very clearly there wasn't. So really didn't matter who you married. If you got married between 1907 and 1922, you were still kind of subject to this. Um, we do have Laura's signature. Again, we know exactly when and where she was born. We have her exact date of marriage and her place of marriage, so we can get her marriage certificate, which will presumably contain a lot of biographical information. So between those details, we can look her up in the census. We can get her marriage certificate. Hopefully, that will have her parents' names on it, and then we'll be able to trace the family um, back in time. Again, I'm not 100% sure that other U.S. district court papers of collections are digitized in the same way the U.S. District Court at Newark happens to be. But I'm very glad that we have this for people in the area to look. Again, I read the top of the form, and that kind of describes the provisions made from the original 1936 laws and how that was altered by the the Nationality Act of 1940. Um, and to me, and I would recommend reading the text of the law, but to me, it sounds like women did not have to go to a particular district court. They could go to they could go to a U.S. district court in their area to take this oath. They did get married between 1907 and 1922. So, again, I understand that this is a whole lot of information. I'm sure you're going to have questions about it. Please let me know. So, censuses and city directories, I've already talked a lot about establishing residencies. These are fantastic tools to use. Um, we are really lucky here in New Jersey because in addition to the federal censuses, we have the New Jersey state censuses 1855 to 1915. If you are looking on the 1850 census and after, and presuming your woman ancestor is married, that's fantastic because the entire household will be listed. And I'm assuming there that if she's married, she is not the head of house. Again, rule of thumb, always look up your women ancestors on any indexes. But if they're not there, there are other ways that you can go about finding them. The best way to actually see them is to check these 1850 censuses first, presuming your female relative lived after then. In New Jersey, we do have census schedules back to 1830. Um, so even if your woman ancestor was not the head of the house, she will be represented by a tick mark under the head of house's information in a particular age group. Um, once you get into the early 20th century, you start to get a lot more demographic information. You can get month and year of birth if you're looking for a birth record, that might be helpful. Country of origin and immigration status, the number of children she has had in total, plus the number of children that are living. Those are two separate figures that can be very useful. Her occupation and home address, and also the number of years married. So all useful information. The state censuses should have similar demographic information, again, depending on the year. Again, this is really nice for those of us in New Jersey because instead of a 10-year gap in information, we have a 5-year gap, which is very nice. Um, my one thing that I think you should be careful of is if a woman suddenly disappears from the census after her spouse dies, I would not automatically assume she's dead. I would check her adult children. Sometimes there are different nicknames. Sometimes people misinterpret how something is spelled, and the data entry is messed up. So if you can't find her, check her adult children and see if you can find them there. And these are all digitized on either Ancestry or Family Search. If you are looking, and remember I said, we know that the federal population schedules go back to 1790. I said New Jersey has schedules from 1830 on. So if you are looking for a census substitute, there's a collection in New Jersey called tax ratables. We're going to be looking at an example of this in a few minutes. And these are your census substitute for those late 19th century and prior uh, census. What is very nice is that you don't necessarily, you may be able to overcome that 5-year gap between state and federal censuses by using city directories, because these are published every year and they're an alphabetical listing of the heads of household, their address, possibly their business address and their occupation. They may also have their living spouse or their recently deceased spouse in parentheses, which can give you clues as to when a spouse may have died, um, and may be useful for filling in census gaps. Now, if a woman is the head of house and she has men living with her who are not head of house, if they are employed, they may have their own entries in the city directories. If you see a woman who's a head of house and there's a man or a boy living at the same address, this may be another way to confirm that somebody has been widowed. What is also nice is if a household has moved, they might still have an entry and indicate in very general terms where they went. So it may have said, oh, removed to Detroit or something like that, which could be incredibly useful. And then also, if you are looking for historical context, especially as we get closer to the 20th century, there are these things called crisscross directories, which allow researchers to see businesses and residential addresses by block. So you can get a good sense of what is in the neighborhood. If there are religious institutions nearby, maybe your ancestor went to that particular church or other house of worship, and you could get records from there. Maybe your ancestor owned one of the businesses in the area. So there might be additional clues for you by looking at the crisscross directory. And if you've checked your female relative on the census, you can't find her after a husband's death, check her in city directories to see if she's become the head of house. That might at least confirm that she is still, in fact, living. There are repositories online that do have city directories. We here at the state library have a physical collection of over 1,000. If you're in the area and want to come research, please come and visit us. Ancestry has a fantastic collection that does have a lot of New Jersey city directories, but not all of the ones that we have. So just keep that in mind. And I just wanted to briefly show you uh, the same household listed in the census and in a city directory. This is Bessie Stark's home. She is the head of house. This is in 1900 in Trenton. Um, and she has been widowed. We know where she is born. We know when she arrived in the United States and how long she has been here. And we have her um, month and year of birth, her age, and the number of children birthed versus the number of children living. She is living with two of her three living children currently. So that is them on the census. And then interestingly, Bessie is listed. Her husband Simon is not listed. She is not a recent widow by 1900. Her husband died in 1889, so she's been widowed for about 11 years here. But interestingly, if you look further down at the bottom of the blue circle, her older son David has his own entry. He's employed. Um, I am not sure why David or why Louis is not listed because he has an occupation as well, but he is not. So David is in this particular case. So it may benefit you to check both the census and the city directories to see what's going on, to compare and contrast how people are listed, and use one or the other to glean a little bit more detail. Another way, so the next three collections we're going to talk about, although they extend up into the 20th century and beyond, we're going to focus on them more for pre-May of 1848 research. You can use these next three collections to establish residency, to maybe verify when somebody died. You can definitely do that in estate papers. Some of the others you can't necessarily. Um, and also to establish kinship relationships. Now, estate papers have been collected in New Jersey since the 1600s. They don't necessarily include a will, but if you have a will, it's a really fantastic thing because it's going to give you that kinship information. There are indexes and the calendar of New Jersey wills, which are both digitized. The index is just a straight up index. The calendar provides a description of what is included in the estate papers for a particular person. If you are researching in the vital records era and into the 20th century, and especially later in the 20th century, check the county surrogates papers. They may have them. The Secretary of State's office stopped collecting wills in 1900, and Superior Court took over from 1901 to 1952. The counties have been collecting wills as well as the state since the county founding date. And those are in the county surrogate's office. Again, check directly for a woman in any of these indexes because, like our example over here, she might be listed directly. But you should check her husband, her parents, her grandparents, and her siblings if you can't find her, because if there is a will included in their state packet, they may have left her a bequest. If she is a close relative, such as, a daughter or a spouse, she might be named an executor. And if she is named an executor or administrator and there's not a will, you may still see her name in the estate documents. Estate documents can also help us narrow down a date of death. In the 20th century, they may straight up give you an exact date of death. Before that, that was less common, but estate papers were generally probated very quickly after a person's death. Um, so you can you can probably guess they died within a few months of the estate being probated. I've included an example on the right. I mostly included this because of this codicil, which is signed, the witnesses are all women. And what happened was that Elizabeth Tatham died in childbirth, unfortunately. Also, her eldest daughter had done something to displease her, so she disinherited her. And this codicil is basically giving her a bequest instead of disowning her. So I thought it was fairly unusual uh, that so many witnesses in this document in 1700 were women. So that's why I included it as our example. I want to talk about how to use uh, what I want to talk about what you do when somebody is not named in a will and how you can tease out that information. The moral of this story is basically in New Jersey, there are recorded copies of wills, which will include the original document and then a summary of the administrative paperwork that was filed, but will not include subsequent documents. And in this case, when we look at Isaac Pearson's will, there's some confusion because when we check him in the colonial marriage bonds, we find two men named Isaac Pearson, and both were and there are bonds with two different women, essentially. We know that Isaac Pearson, who we are interested in following, died December 25th, 1776. He was murdered. He was shot off his horse on that date. Um, and we know that he left a will. That is who we are interested in tracing here. But who was his wife? And the reason that I say this is in his will, he names his loving wife his executor, but he doesn't tell us who she is. So if we just looked at that will, we wouldn't know who she is. Fortunately, when we go to the estate files, there is a codicil. What is interesting is we know he died in 1776. His estate was not probated until 1802, and why is still a mystery. But importantly, we can see that his wife is Elizabeth. We know that he was a very wealthy man, so it makes sense that he would have a colonial marriage bond. If he was widowed, because of his wealth, he probably would have gotten a second one if he remarried. But this codicil confirms, although he did not name his wife in his will, that her name was in fact Elizabeth. And interestingly, although we might not be interested in tracing this, but we might too. I did not follow through with this, and spoiler alert, she's not in the will index. I have not been able to find a date of death for her, although I have investigated based on the clues that I found. We know that from this document that Elizabeth died sometime before this document was filed. And this document is essentially to get new executors for this estate because either the people cannot carry out the executor's duties or they are dead in Elizabeth's case. So if we look at contemporary collections, New Jersey was quite devastated by the Revolutionary War. There were soldiers trooping up, down all around the state, and many people filed damages. Somebody came around to see what they had lost in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. There is a collection called Revolutionary War Damage Claims, and Elizabeth Pearson, who was a widow, filed three of them, all around June of 1778. She filed two against the British Army and one against the American Army. And this is an example of one of her Revolutionary War damage claims. So that establishes where she was. She was living in Burlington County, and that she was alive in 1778. She is also, and this is the last record I've ever been able to find, when we know this is definitely her because Isaac Pearson was from Nottingham and his house was in Nottingham. So if Elizabeth is on this list, it's because she's his widow, um, because he was incredibly wealthy. So this is what this tax rateable looks like. This is the top of the page. It tells you all of the information, all of the various categories that people could be taxed on this year. It gives you the list of people. And then here's Elizabeth's line. It shows you what exactly she is being taxed on within this particular tax year. So we know that she died sometime between 1780 and 1802. If I am ever able to find what actually, when she actually died, I promise I will update this presentation, but I've struck out. I tried her in Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey, see if I could find her gravestone. Um, tried her, uh, tried researching like churches in the area to see if I could figure out which one they went to, if they would have records, and I just have not had any luck so far. So that's as far as I've been able to narrow it down. Would love more information on her. And also, I mean, I'm assuming since she's called Elizabeth Pearson in that codicil that that she did not remarry, because I assume it would have her updated last name if she did remarry after her husband's death, but I don't know. So haven't found anything on her. So this is the last living record that I have of her. So same kind of thing. It's really amazing what you can pull out of these documents to establish kinship. And you wouldn't necessarily think somebody selling land, you would need a whole family history. But if somebody inherited the land, sometimes you do. So this is the opening paragraph, this document on the right. It's the opening paragraph of a land sale between Mary Bullens and members of her family to various parties. What is interesting is all of these people are living in England. They own land over in America, but they live in England. They've never set foot here. Um, and all in this text, we've learned the circumstances of how Mary Bullens came to inherit all of this land. It originally belonged to her uncle, Samuel Barker, and through a series of unfortunate events in his direct line, people died and Mary became the main inheritor. Further down in this document, there is an abstract of Samuel's will where we get more details about the land that he owned, which is very cool, and explains how his grandson died and how his niece Mary came to inherit all of this wealth. Um, in this case, Mary Bullens is indexed. She is the primary person selling land here. However, if a woman was married, um, and her husband, you know, had access to her land and she did not own it in her own right because of marriage, a deed with his name on it might actually be about her land, and her family. So it's always worth looking him up if she doesn't appear outright in that index, or if she's represented as et ux or et uxer, which is Latin for wife. So a deed index might have John Brown and wife, and the deed could be all about her inheritance. Um, these records in New Jersey are available from the Early Land Records collection, which is owned by the State Archives. Some of these are digitized, and you can see the records directly online and download your own copies of them. You do have to still order them in some cases. There are county deeds as well that are filed with the county clerk's office. Again, that county founding date up through the 20th century and 21st century too. The county clerk never stopped collecting land records. And early versions of these county deeds may be available on familysearch.org. Apply the same logic I just applied to this particular item, which is part of the early land records collection, to uh, to the county deeds on Family Search. And I just want to very briefly show you, and remember, that's just the opening paragraph. And here is what I was able to do just from this opening paragraph. I created a 4-generation family tree with just that written information. Shows who died, who's still living, how many kids they had, and the relationship between everybody in 4 generations. So just wanted to quickly show you that before we wrap up. And here are our takeaways from today's presentation. I know I gave you a whole lot to chew on. Take your time, reread slides, click on links, read stuff. And if you have any detailed questions that you would like me to answer or clarify, I'm very happy to. So, first rule of thumb, if anybody lived past May of 1848, look them up in the vital records. And then I hope that I've demonstrated through this presentation how you can start pulling in other collections to build a picture of who somebody was and how you can trace their life. So other collections are going to really help you, especially if you're later into the 19th century. Those census records are going to help you, and city directories may help you as well. Again, always check a woman in a collection index in her own right, but if you can't find her, look at her other relatives. You may be surprised by what you're able to pull together, as we saw with John Spiegelhader. Because his name was so unusual, I was able to very quickly, easily find his family. When I focused in on his wife, there was some very interesting information on her on the census records and on her, and we got her maiden name from her son's death certificate, so we could then trace her and her family backwards potentially. Um, so keep those, if you don't have access to those post 1850 census record, assuming that your woman ancestor was married at 18 before 1850 and was not head of the house, check wills, deeds, and court cases, plus other collections that you may stumble across. Like I stumbled across those repatriation oaths, and those were incredibly good. Revolutionary War damage claims, if somebody is widowed, might be very good if you're going back to that time period. There are all kinds of other collections that you can potentially look at to find more information about a woman. Again, if she disappears from the census, don't necessarily assume that she is dead. Make sure you are cross-checking her on city directories. Maybe she has her own entry there now that she is head of house. And then on the census, always look up her adult kids as well to see if she's living with them and maybe just for whatever reason, she is not indexed on her own. Um, and then finally, we just saw that I was able to build an entire family tree from a short paragraph in a deed. So make sure you're checking collections where you wouldn't expect to find kin information. Deeds and court cases are especially good because they can deal with matters of inheritance, which might require parties to spell out kinship information. So that is what I have for you today, and I am happy to answer any questions. For some of the things, I may need to get back to you by email. I might need to do a little bit more research, and if it's a detailed question about an individual family member, I might not be able to answer it thoroughly live. So thank you, Andrew. Do we have any questions?
Sure. Um, I'm trying to find immigration records for my great grandmother and other female relatives from 1870 to 1890. Any suggestions?
1870 to 1890, you're going to have to follow the example with that we did with John Spiegel Halder. Remember, prior to 1922, unless there was an unusual circumstance, women were largely not naturalizing in their own right. So a woman can still get naturalized, but she's going to do it the same way a minor child would do it, through her husband or her father. That was the most common way for a woman to get naturalized. So she is not, from 1870 to 1890, we saw John Spiegelhalder does not name any of his dependents. We know that he had kids by then. We know that he was married by then. Does not name them at all. So you're going to be looking up a man's record. You're going to be checking him, especially starting in 1900 census when the citizenship started to be confirmed. And you're going to see if he has an NA next to his name. His wife and his children, if he naturalized, may also have NA next to their name, but they naturalized under him. So their names will not appear in any part of those documents in that time period. Now, post 1907, when you get the biographical information like we saw with Catherine Volku, that's when dependents, including a spouse, including children, might be named on the application. So I hope that helps. If you need any clarification on that we can't quickly address here, please feel free to send me an email.
Um, so an American citizen woman who married an immigrant male who was not naturalized before 1907 did not lose citizenship, or was that a
Nope,
practice before?
nope. Unless, so well, you need to be careful about that. It was, it was not widely. Um, you need to look at other laws, um, especially those that were targeting Chinese people, because there may have been provisions in there for Chinese women or people who married people from China to lose their citizenship as well. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head, but as far as I am aware, largely it was that 1907 Expatriation Act where a large swath of women, if they married a foreign-born man, could then lose citizenship. In my notes in the presentation, I have a link on the one slide to a blog written by a naturalization and historian and immigration historian at the National Archives addressing this particular time period. There is also an excellent blog there, which I did not link, about racism and immigration law. And that may address some more of the earlier laws that were passed in the 19th century targeting particularly Chinese immigrants and Chinese born American citizens. That would make it, one, if they were already American, easier to lose their citizenship, or two, make it harder for people um, of that particular race to become citizens.
Are there lists of denaturalized women instead of the renaturalized?
I don't think that there are. Not that I have encountered. If you want to send me an email about that, I could do some research. But all that I found were the repatriation oaths.
If a girl was naturalized through her father's naturalization pre-1907 and then married an alien between 1907 and 1922, did she lose her citizenship, or was it only U.S. born women citizens?
I think she lost her citizenship. You can read, I have the Expatriation Act text link, so that may explain. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure it says if you're a US citizen, you marry a foreigner, you lose your citizenship. But that is just a summary. I would read the text of the law and see what that says, which is linked from the presentation.
When talking about New Jersey wills, does that mean that we can look at wills that have been lawyer prepared and filed, but before someone dies?
Well, I don't know what the law was at the time, and it depends on the law. These are the actual documents. So these are the documents that were filed with the Secretary of State's office when the estate was probated. And those are the early ones. So I would guess these are not drafts. These are the final recorded versions that are filed when somebody dies and when the estate is probated. So I hope that answers your question. If you want me to email that and I can send you like a collection description of what the Secretary of State's wills are, I'm happy to do that.
I didn't hear whether you have deeds for New Jersey land from the 1860s through 1870s, and then I assume a married woman wouldn't be on that deed.
Now, she might be on that deed. So anything, um, and this is on the slides. So any land records that are from the 1790s up through the, well, even up through the 20th century are also maybe filed with the county clerk's office. So those are continuously filed there, and a woman could be listed on those. So it's always worth checking her there. But those are not organized statewide, that particular collection. These are the deeds that were filed with the county clerk. So, and especially 1860s to 1870s, that's the time period where those would be filed with the clerk. So you'll need to know the person where they were living at the time, and you can do research on the county. Now, if just the husband was selling land, the wife might not be listed, but if she was involved in the land sale somehow, then she would be listed.
Um, do you know if the state archives has records of the Seventh-day Baptist denomination?
So the State Archives is the records repository for New Jersey State Executive Department records. They do have a small collection of private papers related to prominent New Jerseyans and prominent New Jersey families, but largely they are probably not going to have records related to a particular religious denomination unless it relates to a prominent New Jersey family. You can always email the state archives to check their holdings, but again, they're looking to capture records from state departments. So probably not.
What are the ways to find a divorce record? And this would be circa 1915.
1915, talk to the state archives. They do have indexes to divorces and they have records. Um, any collections that you don't see on their main site, they do have a large menu of both indexes that you can search, plus order forms where you can order records collections from them. If you ever don't see a records collection, send an email to njarchives@sos.nj.gov. And they will have divorces. They have divorces up through 1947 or 1948, I believe.
Did New Jersey do rural directories for people with farms in the 1860s and 1870s? Perhaps county directories instead of city directories?
Yes, there are examples of one, overall county directories, and two, also smaller communities that would band together to to have a directory for a particular area. So in some cases, yes, um, but those are usually pretty limited. It's usually focused on more populous towns, um, and larger cities as well. What's interesting, and I know this is out of the time period you're looking for, we at the State Library have digitized farm directories for a few years in the 19 teens. Um, and I believe it's for Gloucester, Salem. I don't think it's Burlington County. It might be Gloucester, Salem, and Cumberland counties, and there might be a fourth one in there as well. And they're farm directories, so they do list farmers in those particular areas. But again, it's only for a few years. It's out of the time period you want. But yes, in some cases, directories like that did exist. Um, if you send me an email and let me know what specifically you're looking for, I'm happy to check our city directory catalog, and we can see what specifically we have.
If a woman with young children loses her husband, would she have been appointed guardian of the children, or would another male have been appointed guardian?
So this is a good question for you to email me. It depends on whether or not we're talking about physical guardianship or guardianship over their property. So send me an email. That sounds like a simple question, but it's a little bit more complicated.
Um, are there any AI apps that will automatically search all these databases, like the directories, the indexes, available documents?
I don't know enough about the AI technology to tell you that. What I can tell you is on October 8th, we had a really fantastic presentation done by somebody who, Andrew, what is her name?
Uh,
Melanie?
it was Melanie McComb.
Yeah, Melanie McComb. Uh, and that presentation, they were very kind to let us host it and host the recording for about a month. So I would go watch that. She has a lot of information about using AI in genealogy. We do not have access to AI tools here at the state library. I don't use them professionally. Melanie has some tips and tricks for how you can use AI and some of the cool things that are happening. Um, so that would be my personal recommendation. All I can tell you is it looks like some of the individual services are starting to come out with AI tools.
Um, Somebody posted that there are no AI apps that search behind paywalls or search databases at this point. And they said that that has been confirmed in many of the AI webinars they have attended. So, I mean, we can give it a couple more minutes, see if any other questions come in, but anything you kind of want to reiterate or wrap up with, Regina?
Well, I know I threw a lot at you all today. Um, just remember the most important things that you can do. When you check a records collection and you want to find more information, especially if you're looking in the 19th century and especially if you're looking after 1850, go to the census and go to the city directories. Um, that will hopefully be your best bet for confirming residents, confirming people are where they say they are at the time of the record you're looking for, and hopefully give you some more clues or, confirm information that you found in one collection that will progress your story forward. Also, do not be afraid because you are trying to trace a woman, don't assume just because she's less likely to be somewhere that she's not going to be there or not going to be represented in a records collection. And always make sure that you are checking her. Finally, like I mentioned before, the National Archives has some really great blogs that are cited and link you directly to resources about the citizenship issues that women were facing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Um, and I would highly recommend looking some of those up. I do have the one linked in the presentation. And if anybody would like to email me, I can send you the one about the Chinese laws that were largely targeting Chinese immigrants, but did carry over to other groups. Those have a truly fantastic wealth of information. Um, and they are worth checking out and they are worth knowing about.
Um, any suggestions for common names like Mary Murphy?
Yeah, those are hard, especially depending on the records collection you're looking for. Now, with vital records, you're going to get lots and lots of clues because the vital records will have some personal identifying information that you might be able to narrow down. If you are just working straight from the census and you're not sure about her existing family members, ooh, yeah, it's it's very, very, very tough. Um, I would say if you have a few context clues, you're in much better shape. Like if you know where exactly she was living, That might help narrow down. Maybe you can take 500 Mary Murphys down to maybe about 50, especially if she's not in a big city. If you know her husband's name and he had a little bit more of an unusual name, maybe that might help you narrow her down. Or if she had very distinctive children's names as well, that might help you find her in particular. Um, so I would say it definitely helps if you have at least one basic detail, like where you're looking for her to start with, and then hopefully you can narrow from there. And if you have some specifics or would like help with the Mary Murphy, send me an email and I will do my best to try to help you narrow down who the right person is. But mostly to start with, a location is usually useful. If you have that information, you may be able to filter down from there.
Where is the best place to look for probate inventories?
So for New Jersey, and depending on the time period, you're going to want to look in those pre-1900 papers at the Secretary of State's office. And that's the collection that the state archives has. We looked at that will from Elizabeth Tatham. One of the things I did not include was the inventory for her estate. As I may have mentioned, she was a very wealthy woman. So she has a several page long inventory. Um, and what's nice is that index, the index to New Jersey wills, will tell you if an inventory is included in the estate papers or not.
All right, well, thank you so much, Regina, for presenting today, and thank you for everybody attending. We hope you found it informational, and as was discussed, it is very jam-packed, so please, if you have a minute, take a look at the handout or take a look at the genealogy research guide, available on the State Library's website that Regina curates, for a lot more information.
And
Um,
email me too.
yeah, yeah. Yes, Regina is very, very eager to help, so please take advantage of her knowledge and expertise, for all your genealogy questions. So, well, I hope everybody had a great October, a great National Family History Month. We hope you enjoyed the programming that we put on, and we look forward to doing this again next year. So, in the meantime, everybody be safe, be well, and hopefully we'll see you soon.